Where to begin? Dialogue is one of those aspects of teaching writing that suffers from a certain lack of exactness. It's hard to even know what specifically a writing teacher means when they say dialogue, much less good dialogue. A lot of people talking about good writing in films and television are referring to the dialogue. But do they mean the content of the dialogue or the poetic or witty quality of the dialogue? Or both? Is good dialogue only good dialogue if it is clever or witty or moving? Is that what we mean by good dialogue? Or is it some other secret, mysterious thing? Spoiler alert, yes. So to start with, dialogue is, as I'm sure you know, the exchange of usually spoken lines between two or more characters. We already know this. Character A says, "My friend, what a fine hat." Character B says, when I think of dialogue, I'm not thinking about the random quotable lines that get thrown around a lot. You know, make him an offer he can't refuse. You are hiding enemies of the state, aren't you? There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Will you still fight? Ask my sword. This is not dialogue. I mean, it is, obviously, but whether or not your dialogue is quotable or fit for an inspirational poster does not have anything to do with it being good dialogue. What this is writing, and it can't be taught. You can absolutely learn how to write well, like this, but I can't teach that. No one can. That's an element of developing your own style. That's something you can only do for yourself. But what makes dialogue good? The first and most important thing we need to define then is what exactly constitutes good dialogue. To be good in the storytelling sense, dialogue must do 4 things. It must serve the plot, it must be story-shaped, it must be consistent with the characters, and it must be alive. Okay. These principles that I'm about to talk about are relevant to all forms of storytelling, no matter the medium. Novels, web novels, manga, comics, video games, screenplays, stage plays, etc. But before we break these principles down in detail, I want to take a moment to touch on an aspect of style specific to those of you storytellers who work in a written medium, such as novels, web novels, etc., and have to write more than just dialogue. I'm talking about all the he said, she answered, etc. The labels that indicate to the reader who is talking. That is entirely a matter of style, but there's a hateful piece of advice that I still see make the rounds now and again that said is dead. Meaning that you should avoid things like he said, and instead use things like he shouted, or he whispered, or, he chortled. I'm assuming this has something to do with them being more economically descriptive or something. I don't know. You can use those if you want to, you can use a mixture, it doesn't matter. It's up to you and based solely on your own personal style. But said is in no way dead. When you add labels to your written dialogue, the main goal is to make sure that it's clear to the audience who is speaking at any given time, and to not have so much labeling that the flow of the conversation is disrupted. Figuring that out will take practice, but feel free to experiment and figure out what to do in a way that pleases you. All right, moving on. To my mind, dialogue, like all aspects of a story, must serve the plot to some degree. This means that good dialogue, no matter how witty, poetic, or well-worded it is or isn't, must serve to progress the plot in some way, or at least the audience's understanding of the plot. It is possible to fit in brief conversations or lines within the conversations that don't directly serve the plot. But because these lines don't serve the plot, you have to be very careful and very sparing with them. But a good writer will limit the non-relevant lines, endeavoring to keep the dialogue relevant as much as possible. Now, when I say that you ought to limit your dialogue to only that which is relevant to your plot, I do not mean by that limit your dialogue. You can have as much or as little dialogue as you want. They can be brief conversations or long ones. That part isn't what I'm talking about. That is an aspect of style. If you want your characters to have long, heavy conversations spanning dozens of pages, then do that. But the overall conversation simply needs to serve the plot. That's all. Well, it also needs to be story-shaped. Now, we've talked before about things being story-shaped, but to refresh, a thing is story-shaped when you have at least one character who has at least one goal. that's a story. Whenever we talk about story shapes, I bring out the usual guy here, the mini arc. This is a great way to visualize a story shape. Character trying to achieve a goal, with either success or failure coming at the mini climax of this mini arc. Reiterating the shape throughout the structure of your story creates excellent, pleasing flow and rhythm, but it also helps you, the writer, keep the story focused, which is always a good thing. And while it's pretty clear that you ought to make sure your scenes and your larger sections of story, etc., all use this story shape, how is that relevant to dialogue? How can dialogue be story shaped? Let's think about this for a minute. For a thing to be story-shaped, it must be, as I said, at least one character trying to achieve at least one goal. So with story-shaped dialogue, you will see that within the conversation, your characters are trying to achieve a goal with the conversation. The purpose of their dialogue is to accomplish a specific set goal, a goal which is hopefully relevant to the plot. You can call this a conversation goal if you want. That is to say, with every conversation, the characters participating need to have a goal that they are trying to accomplish with the conversation. It can happen that only one of the characters has a goal. You see this in investigative stories. The detective, journalist, etc. goes up to a potential witness and says, when was the last time you saw the murder victim? The detective's main goal in that conversation is to obtain information that will help him solve the murder. The witness doesn't necessarily have to have a goal per se. You could say that the witness's goal is to deliver pertinent information, or in the case of a lying witness, to hide incriminating evidence from the investigator. But neither of those cases has to be present. The main point here is that conversations can occur in which only one of the participants has a clear conversation goal, but it's more common for both or all to have a goal with the conversation. There is always a conversation goal. So when we approach dialogue, we really do need to be keeping this story structure in mind, which is to say we need to keep in mind what the characters' conversation goals are. I love long conversations in books and movies, probably more than the average person does, but I do like knowing that those conversations are going somewhere and are plot relevant. So to rephrase the second rule of dialogue, the conversation, the dialogue, must be built into the structure of the story. How do we do that? As you have probably guessed, the mini arc. This little dude really is the MVP of story structuring, I gotta say. So, as the dialogue is unfolding between the characters, one or both, or all, have to be working towards some goal. But you, the writer, also have to be guiding the overall arc of the conversation to a story goal, which will almost always be either a plot or a character development goal. Be careful with dialogue that is just meant for character development. Too much can imbalance the plot's flow. As you construct the shape of the dialogue, that is, when you build in these layered goals, you need to also remember what plot or character elements are being developed by this dialogue. That is, what is the plot goal of the conversation mini arc? Let's try to make this clearer with some visuals. So we have this section of story's mini arc. This particular mini arc is about the size of a scene. So this is your scene's mini arc. The conversation takes place within the scene. Sometimes a conversation is a scene. That's fine, and even more common. Sometimes a conversation is just part of a scene. There's no rule there. Just write it how you want to write it and focus on building the structure. Here's the story scene's mini arc. Here's the conversation mini arc. For this visualization, we'll make the conversation the scene, so it will fit in like so. You, the writer, need to have a planned plot goal for your conversation. Meanwhile, your characters will use two for this visualization, but remember, it's just whoever is participating in the conversation need to have their goals for the conversation. Things that they want in the story world. Information, allegiance, friendship, proving a point, spreading a rumor, and so on. The end result, that is, the finished written dialogue, layers all three. So within the dialogue, you have character goal and story goal. Both need to be kept in mind as you write the dialogue. Character goal, plot goal, good dialogue. You might find yourself thinking, but that's not always how it works in real life. That's true. It really is. And as much as we want our stories to feel as realistic as possible, it is the job of the storyteller to build a cohesive narrative using realistic elements. But the build a narrative part, that is tell a story is the storyteller's primary obligation. To that end, sometimes things that are realistic have to be rearranged to make them have more of a story shape, like dialogue. This story shape is important because that is the shape of a narrative. The mind of the audience is following a flow of narrative information, character plus goal. So everything you, the writer, present to them ought to adhere to this flowing shape. If a conversation occurs that is not story-shaped, that is, does not have a clear goal on the part of at least one of the characters, the audience will still subconsciously try to find that shape in the dialogue. And if they fail to do so, this will disrupt their engagement in the story, disrupt the flow of the narrative, and undermine and even damage your story's structure. Yes, it does happen that writers will break this rule and just have conversations for the sake of the conversation. That's true. Most of the time, these conversations will occur in books that have a far less structural shape and are less interested in creating or maintaining a cohesive narrative. That is not the type of story I personally am interested in writing. Therefore, that's not the kind of structure I'm interested in examining. Now, as I said, audiences naturally follow a narrative's flow. As a result, dialogue that doesn't fit into it tends to stand out. If a writer attempts to lay down some other piece of information but does so outside the structure of the existing conversation instead of within it, that can be very glaring to the audience as an odd, awkward addition to the conversation that their minds can't quite place in the flow of the narrative. In J.J. Abrams' second Star Trek movie, Into Darkness, for example, there is a tense conversation between Captain Kirk and Khan, in which Kirk is trying to get Khan to agree to help him. In the midst of this uneasy exchange, the writers attempted a very poorly constructed comical aside in which Kirk demanded to know what Dr. McCoy was doing to some random dead tribble, and McCoy delivered the line about Khan's blood having regenerative properties. Let's try to picture the structure of this scene. The goal of Kirk in this conversation was to convince Khan to help him carry out a dangerous mission that could save the lives of everyone on their ship. This was something of a negotiation, so Khan's goal was to get something valuable for his trouble. They went back and forth for a few lines, building up to the mini-climax of the scene in which Khan would either agree or refuse. But instead of that happening, suddenly Kirk asks McCoy this random question. We never hit the mini-climax. The question Kirk asked McCoy didn't come within any other kind of mini arc of any size. The arc was chopped, some weird misshapen thing had been poorly grafted to the end of it. McCoy's random exposition about Khan's blood was followed up with Kirk saying to Khan, "Are you coming with me or not?" And they called it a day. This is very bad dialogue. Despite the fact that it was arguably a little funny, and despite the fact that it was attempted foreshadowing, very bad foreshadowing, it was still bad dialogue. And the biggest factor here was its horrendously bad structuring. Contrast that with Harvey Dent's now famous line from The Dark Knight. This line of his, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain," was painfully foreshadowing his own fate. But this line occurred within a beautifully structured conversation in which he, Bruce Wayne, Rachel, and Natasha, Moscow Ballet's prima ballerina, were arguing about the Batman vigilante. We can determine the story shape of this conversation arc by looking at everyone's goals. Natasha and Mr. Wayne, in ironic disguise mode, were arguing that the Batman vigilante was a menace and that the city of Gotham was wrong to idolize him. Harvey and Rachel argued that he was doing some good and that Gotham was proud that one of their own was out there standing up for what was right. Harvey's opinion of Batman was far more glowing and admiring than even Rachel's. He drew the comparison between Gotham and ancient Rome, reminding them that Rome would, in times of crisis, suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. Rachel and Natasha then pointed out that the last man they appointed was a guy named Caesar who refused to give up the power. At which point, Harvey delivered his iconic line. Viewers who didn't already know the story of Harvey Dent only realized the full significance of this line when Harvey's tragic fate was realized much later. With this line, Harvey, in a sense, was arguing that both views had parts of the truth. He conceded that the Batman vigilante was a temporary measure, and that true justice needed to be restored in Gotham, suggesting that he was the very man for that job. It showed Bruce Wayne that Harvey really was a crusader for justice after his own heart, as he had hoped, which was the mini-climax of this conversation and arc, and gave gave us the therefore of Bruce deciding to throw his support behind Harvey, which led to the fundraising party, and so on through the progression of the plot. This conversation, including that eminently quotable line, was built into the structure of the plot and of the scene and of the conversation. Not just this one line, but the whole conversation was an example of good dialogue. One of the big reasons we even think favorably of Harvey's famous line is because it was structured so well into the existing dialogue. So it was delivered to our minds with proper flow and structuring. So hopefully you can see pretty clearly how this structuring of a good conversation is almost always going to fit into that story-shaped arc. We've spent long enough on this. Let's move on. Dialogue is necessarily going to be spoken by characters. These characters are going to then necessarily have their own characteristics, their own personalities. A character who is funny will say funny things. A character who is stoic will probably not use very many words. A character with an advanced education or who is particularly scholarly will probably be more eloquent. All of that is true and worth keeping in mind. But a secondary aspect of characters that is sometimes not taken into consideration is that they're going to also have their own motivations and personal character narrative goals. The goals in this case being the most relevant. By and large, dialogue is meant to move the plot along. Plots must have characters. Characters, as we just talked about, will have goals within the conversation. Remember though, characters also have their own larger overarching narrative goal. They have something that they are trying to accomplish within the overall story, or at least this section of story that they are in. Now, when those characters who have those goals participate in a conversation within which they will also have some kind of smaller specific goal, that goal, their conversation goal, must be consistent with the character's goals in general, whether that's the overall story goal or the goal for this section of the story or what have you. If you choose a certain character to deliver lines of dialogue, those lines of dialogue must then be consistent with that character as you've written them. So remember, within a conversation, over and above the plot goals and the mini arc goals, you need to remember the characters themselves, not just their personalities and characteristics, although that is very important too, but also their goals in the conversation and their overall goals. That is, you need to keep their conversation goal consistent with who they are and what they want in general. This one sounds a little odd, I'll grant you, but let me explain. If you think of a script or a play or something like that, you will see the lines of dialogue that must be delivered by the characters in a nice, neat list. It's not really up to the characters what they say, just as it's not up to the actors what they say. If a character's line is shocking, such as, I don't know, your mom ran away with the milkman, the other actor isn't actually shocked and choosing how to respond to that. They look at the script and say what it tells them to say. Simple. We all know this. Now, the writer is the person who puts those lines together. So the writer will need to determine just how shocked or angry that character is to learn that her mom just took off with the milkman, and then give her an appropriate line. Again, we know this. The trick here is to make sure that this line, her response to this news, is in fact appropriate and not just the next piece of information the writer needs to convey. This is, as I said, that difficult to define element of dialogue, that it has to be living. The characters can't just have a list of lines they need to exchange. The lines themselves have to indicate to the audience that the characters are clearly listening to what the other person is saying and then answering accordingly. So the lines have to be reacting to each other. Put another way, the dialogue has to feel like the lines answer each other, not just that they occur in succession. This is really hard to explain. Let me pull up a good example of this done badly. I usually turn off movies and throw aside books that do this too egregiously, so I had to really dig into my distant repressed memories for this one. And so let's look at this made-for-TV Hallmark mystery. No, I'm not picking on made-for-TV cozy mysteries. There are a lot of these that I think are very good, just not this one. So in this one, a woman, Jane, has learned that she's inherited her mother's detective agency or something, but she doesn't really want to keep it, and so she's trying to figure out how to handle it, when one night this random high school girl shows up on her doorstep begging for her help to find her long-lost mom. This is how the conversation went from there. Jane says, "I'm sorry you're going through all this, but I don't think I'm the right person to help." Leah replies, "I know it sounds crazy, I don't even remember her, but I know in my heart that my mom never would have left me on purpose." This This is dialogue crime number 1. How is, I know it sounds crazy, a natural response to, I don't think I'm the right person to help you? Let's move on. After a little exposition, Jane says, I lost my mom too, etc., etc. I get that there's a hole in your heart that's impossible to fill. Leah says, you get it. I know my mom didn't leave me. Again, how is this a natural response to what Jane said? A little more exposition, then Jane says, again, I really don't know if I'm the right person to help you. And Leah answers, she promised she'd never leave me. And then randomly starts playing the piano, which triggers a brief exchange about how talented she is and how she got into Juilliard, but she can't go because she can't afford it. And then Leah suddenly whips out an envelope and says, I wrote down everything I know. Dad says mom's missing money can never be found. What missing money? Not only that, now it sounds like the only reason this girl has decided to look for her mom is to get her hands on that money. So after a brief exchange about the money, we cycle back around to, will you help me? Jane says, Leah, I don't know. Then Leah says, I know, it sounds hopeless, but that's all I have. Hope. Was this girl even listening? Jane has said 3 times so far in the span of less than 2 minutes that she'd love to help, but can't because she's not qualified and wouldn't know how to conduct such an investigation. Nothing about it being hopeless. And the girl hasn't said anything to convey a sense of hopelessness, merely a sense of frustration that no one will take her seriously. This line about hope was supposed to be a lovely dramatic moment, but it made no sense. And so it sounded canned and unnatural. It sounded like nothing more than a line from a script. This entire conversation was just an exchange of lines. Whenever Jane said something, Leah's written response did not answer it. It merely delivered more information. Jane hardly ever responded to Leah's lines beyond the repeated, I'm not the right person to help you. And yes, there was some very poor acting on display here, but it was the written lines that killed this scene. Put aside any talk of structure or character goals or character consistency, at no point did the audience get the impression that these two people were actually talking to each other, that they were listening to what the other person was saying and then responding to it in the continued pursuit of their own goals. I'll get to that. And I'm not talking about wooden acting. I'm talking about the content of the written dialogue. For fun, let's rework a little of this dialogue. So character A, Leah in this case, says basically, will you help me find my mom? Character B, Jane, says, Leah, I'm not an investigator. I wouldn't even know where to start. And then Leah hears that, and because her goal is to convince this detective agency to help, says, well, who would? Is there an actual investigator here that I can talk to? And Jane could say, we sometimes work with a detective from the police department. I could put you in touch with him. And Leah hears that and says, I already talked to the police. They won't listen to me. And Jane, clearly sympathetic, might say, why won't they listen to you? Which could give the writers room for Leah to launch into her exposition. I told them my mom wouldn't just leave me. I mean, look at how she wrote about me in her diary. Would someone who wrote that just take off? But they said this wasn't enough, and so on and so on. The difference between mine and theirs is that I made sure that the characters' lines of dialogue came as a response to what the other character had said. Leah's goal was to get someone to help her find her mom. So as she heard Jane's reasons for refusing, she'd need to adjust her tactics in order to maintain her pursuit of that goal. The writers needed to deliver information, which they did, but they did so in a way that was basically a list of lines and a list of information, rather than a living exchange of dialogue. In my version, the delivery of plot information became an organic response to a line of dialogue. For dialogue to be living, it needs to feel like it is an actual natural exchange. The way you do this is to make sure that the characters are actually responding to each other. They might not understand each other, they might be argumentative, they might lie to each other, but people who are talking are responding to each other. If the person you're talking to says something that doesn't make sense as a response, you'll get confused. If you ask your friend if they want to go get coffee and they answer, I don't know what movies are playing at the theater today, you would be confused. If this ever happens, if a person doesn't listen or seems to be replying with nonsense within a story, there needs to be a plot reason for that. You see? As I said, this is a little difficult to define, but luckily this is one of those dialogue rules that is really glaringly obvious when it is broken. Just honestly assess your dialogue after you've written it to make sure that what is being said is really a natural exchange, while also still allowing the characters who are talking to pursue their conversation goals. I strongly advise reading your dialogue out loud as if in a play. You might feel ridiculous, you might not want to do so in public, but it's a good way to feel out the natural flow of the dialogue. And by flow, I mean the sense that each line is being answered by the next in some way. The main thing you need to remember with a living conversation is what the character's goals are, both the immediate and the overall. Remember that the conversation is alive, so the immediate goals might need to be adjusted mid-conversation in order for the character to continue pursuing the overall goal. For instance, in my version of Jane and Leah's conversation, Leah originally wanted Jane herself to agree to investigate her mom's disappearance. That was her conversation goal. When she realized Jane was possibly unqualified and therefore unwilling, she switched her conversation goal to finding someone else within the organization who could help her, because her overall goal was to find out what happened to her mom. Another tiny example of what I mean by that: imagine a detective character goes to interview the murder victim's next door neighbor, specifically to find out if he saw something on the night the victim was murdered. That's his immediate conversation goal. The neighbor says no, but asks the detective if he'll be able to get the camcorder back that he lent the victim a week ago, or is it some kind of evidence now? But the police never found a camcorder in the house, so now the detective's going to adjust his goal. Now he wants to know why the victim wanted to borrow a camcorder in the year of our Lord 2025 and why it's missing. Maybe the killer took it. Now his immediate conversation goal is to find out everything he can about that camcorder, because his overall goal is catching the killer. Living dialogue sometimes needs to adapt. Just always keep in mind the character's overall goal. Really quickly before I wrap things up, I want to make a note about the actual writing process for dialogue. This is just a little bonus tip, and I did touch on this a little in my first drafts video. When you're hammering out the first draft of your dialogue, I strongly suggest doing so without the added prose labeling. You know, the he said and then she answered and so on. Instead, format it more like a script. Simple, one line after another. Here is a small bit of a conversation I wrote as an example, which we do not have time for in this video, but you can see how the dialogue is actually bullet points. This allows you to write focusing solely on the content of the dialogue. Later, you can go back and write the actual scene if your medium is written, such as novels or web novels or what have you. This is just something I find incredibly helpful. Doing the dialogue in phases like that really decreases the workload on your brain and, in my opinion, results in better dialogue. But that's just me. You should experiment to see what works best for you. Just remember, when it comes to your own personal writing process and methods, there are no rules. Do what works for you. Anyway, I desperately need to get more coffee and try to get some writing done today. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I do try to answer all questions if I have time. As always, thank you very much for watching and happy writing.